This is KQED. The following sounds that you are going to hear are vibrations of the diaphragm in your speaker. And they're not really human voices or musical instruments, but just that. They never let you in on that. And in exactly the same way, the universe doesn't let you in on the truth that all sense experiences are vibrations of the self. Not just yourself, but the self. And all of us share this self in common because it is pretending to be all of us. Brahman, the ultimate principle, plays hide and seek eternally. And he does it for unspeakably long periods of time. The Hindus measure time in what is called a kalpa, K-A-L-P-A. That's 4,320,000 years. Don't take this seriously. It's not meant to be taken literally. But just for an unspeakably long time, the Brahman, the self, pretends that it's lost and is us. And all our adventures and all our troubles and all our agonies and tragedies, it gets mixed up in them. Then after the period of 4,320,000 years has elapsed, there is a catastrophe. The universe is destroyed in fire. And after that, the Brahman wakes up and says, well, good, crazy, what an adventure that was. He wipes the sweat off his brow and says, whew, let's rest a while. So for another 4,320,000 years, the divine self rests and knows who it is. It's me. Then it says, well, this is rather boring. Let's get going again. Let's get mixed up. And it does it in a very strange way because the way the Hindus time it, the first period of getting mixed up, getting lost, is beautiful. That's the longest period. Everything's right. It's just life is glorious. Then it has the next period in which things get a little wonky. Something is vaguely out of order. That doesn't last so long. Then the next period, the third, is when good and evil are equally balanced. And that's still not so long. Finally comes the shortest period when everything bad triumphs and the whole thing blows up and we begin all over again. We're supposed to be living in that now. It's what's called the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness. And it began on Friday, February the 23rd, 3123 BC. And it has 5,000 years to run. But as it goes on, time gets faster, so don't worry. So you see, that's a theory of nature as a drama. It's a play. Now there's a third theory of nature, which is Chinese. And this is very interesting. The Chinese word for nature, they call zhiran. And this expression means of itself so.
Happy feasting.
What happens of itself.
Pleased to meet you.
Or we might say spontaneity. It almost means automatic, because automatic is what is self-moving. Only we associate the word automatic with machinery. But zhiran, what is so of itself, is associated in the Chinese mind not with machinery, but with biology.
This is gonna burn.
Your hair grows by itself. You don't have to think how to grow it. Your heart beats by itself. You don't have to make up your mind how to beat it. That's what they mean by nature. The poem says, sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes and grass grows of itself.
First one.
Complete.
Game just started.
So their principle of nature is called a Tao, T-A-O, pronounced Dao in the Mandarin dialect, Tao in the Shanghai dialect,
Good
To
work.
in the Cantonese dialect. Take your choice. Tao means the course of nature. And Lao Tzu, who was a philosopher who lived a little later than 400 BC, wrote a book about the Tao. And he said, the Tao which can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. You can't describe it. He said the principle of the Tao is spontaneity. He said the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. It accomplishes merits and lays no claim.
No, yes, there is. Just do yourself a favor and
So
don't
there
even
is a
bother
very
leaving
great
the fountain
difference
next time.
between the Chinese idea of Tao
Time to run it down mid,
as the
baby.
informing principle of nature and the Judeo-Christian idea of God as nature's Lord and Master. Because the Tao does not act as a boss. In the Chinese philosophy of nature, nature has no boss. There is no principle that forces things to behave the way they do. It is a completely democratic theory of nature. Correspondingly, most Westerners, whether they be Christians or non-Christians, don't trust nature. Of all things, nature is the thing least to be trusted. You must manage it. You must watch out for it. It will always go wrong if you don't watch out. You know, the goblins will get you. So we're always dealing that you can't trust it. See, we're absolutely instilled with the idea of original sin. You can't trust nature because it comes out with weeds and insects. And above all, you can't trust human nature. Because if you don't hold a club over yourself, you'll go out and rape your grandmother.
Trying to run it down mid, baby.
Now the Chinese would say,
There's no lying
if you
team.
can't trust
There is one
yourself,
stupid.
you can't trust. Because if you can't trust yourself, can you trust your mistrust of yourself? Is that well-founded? If you can't trust yourself, you are totally mixed up.
Be right back.
You haven't a leg to stand on, you haven't a point of departure for anything. And in this respect, the Taoist philosophy and the Confucian philosophy are in agreement. In Confucius philosophy, the fundamental virtue of a human being is called
Ultimate is down.
Enemy spotted.
spelled Jen for reasons best known to Chinese scholars.
Attack. On my way.
I don't know what they are.
Enemy
It's pronounced
spotted.
Ren.
Attack.
And it's a character, Chinese character,
Thanks.
that Confucius placed as the highest of all virtues, higher than righteousness, higher than benevolence,
Not the best there is.
and it means approximately human-hearted.
Be careful. On my way. Be careful.
Now,
Just do yourself a favor and don't even bother leaving the fountain.
Confucius once said that goody-goodies are the thieves of
Trying to
virtue.
run it down mid, baby.
Virtue in Chinese is stiff. We Romanize it as
You really thought you
V-E-H.
could tame this amount of God-given talent? You don't want this smoke.
And it means virtue not in the
There's
sense
no
of
lying
moral
team. There
propriety,
is one in stupid.
but virtue in the sense of
We got a
manner,
big brain over
as
here.
when we speak of the healing virtues of a certain
Good
kind.
morning, gamers.
A man of true virtue is therefore a human-hearted man.
On my way.
Just do yourself a favor and don't even
And
bother leaving the
The
fountain next
meaning
time.
of this is that one should above all trust human nature in the full recognition that it's both good and bad, that it's both loving and selfish.
Enemy spotted. It is ready.
Now, let me give an illustration of the wisdom. When people fight wars, I trust if the reason for which they fight a war is to expropriate somebody else's possessions and women, Because they will fight a merciful war. They will not destroy the possessions and the women that they want to capture.
Just do yourself a
They
favor
want to
and don't
enjoy
even
them.
bother leaving the fountain next
And that's a
time.
war based on simple, ordinary, everyday human greed.
Ultimate is ready.
The most awful wars that are waged are the wars waged for moral principles.
Be right back.
You are a lousy communist. You have a philosophy that is destructive to religion and to everything that we love and value and reverence, and therefore we will exterminate you to the last man unless you surrender unconditionally. Such wars are ruthless beyond belief.
On my way.
We can blow up whole cities, wipe people out, because we are not greedy. We are righteous. That is why the Buddhists are the
Trying to run it down
If you
me,
are going to do
baby?
something evil, do it for a plain, honest, selfish motive. Don't do it in the name of God.
We got a big brain over here.
Because if you do, it turns you
You don't want this smoke.
no longer human. Satan, the pure destroyer.
You
So
really
an
thought you could obtain
inflexibly
this amount of
righteous
God-given
person
talent?
is not
Now that's a 200 IQ play if I've ever
And
seen
that is
one.
why,
Why was he
in
even
Chinese
there?
ideas of justice,
On my way.
a good judge is not somebody who abides by the
Enemy
book.
spotted. On my way. Enemy
Their
spotted.
idea of justice is, for God's sake, keep the case out of court.
Minions have reached your fort.
Let us have a consultation behind the scenes. And let's arrange a compromise. Because we know
Sorry guys, my brain just disconnected
opponent
there.
is aroused. I know I am aroused.
There's no I in team, but there is
And
one in
therefore
stupid.
there can be a mutual arrangement between thieves.
That is.
So we summon Hall, we talk about it, and we call the judge in an unofficial capacity.
Be careful.
And the judge hums and haws, and if he's a good judge,
This is epic.
he has a sense of what it's called to
Just
lead.
do yourself a favor and don't even bother leaving the fountain
I'm going
next
to talk to you about another meaning of the word pronounced lead later on, but it's quite a different word.
Ultimate is ready.
You've been listening to a talk by Alan Watts. I was talking a great deal yesterday afternoon about the Buddhist attitude to change, to death, to the transience of the world, and was showing that preachers of all kinds stir people up in the beginning by alarming them about change. That's like somebody, actually raising an alarm, just in the same way as if I want to pay you a visit, I ring the doorbell,
Be careful. Enemy spotted.
and then we can come in and I don't need to raise an alarm anymore. So, in the same way, it sounds terrible, you see, that everything is going to die and pass away, and here you are, thinking that happiness, sanity, and security consist in clinging on to things which can't be clung to, and in any case, there isn't anybody to cling to.
Not the best there is.
The whole thing is the weaving of smoke.
Just do yourself a favor and don't even bother leaving
So,
the fountain next time.
that's the initial standpoint. But as soon as you really discover this, and you stop clinging to change,
You really thought you could obtain
then
this
everything
amount of
is
God-given
quite
talent?
different. It becomes
No I
amazing.
in team, but there is one in stupid.
Not only
Minions have reached your
do
fort.
all your senses become more wide awake,
That is.
not only do
Trying to
you
run it down mid, baby?
feel almost that you're walking on air,
There's no I in
but
team,
you see
there is one in stupid.
finally that there is no
Just do yourself a
duality,
favor and don't even bother
no
leaving
difference
the fountain next time.
between
Those chicks just got clapped. Hashtag thank you.
the
You really
ordinary
thought you
world
could obtain this amount of God-given
and the
talent?
nirvana
Now that's a
world.
200 IQ play if I've ever seen one. Double kick.
they're the same world, but what makes the difference is the point of view. And of course, if you keep identifying yourself with some sort of stable entity that sits and watches the world go by. You don't acknowledge your union, your inseparability from everything else that there is. You go by with all the rest of the things, but if you insist on trying to take a permanent stand, on trying to be a permanent witness of the flux,
On my way.
then it grates against you, and you feel very uncomfortable. But it is a fundamental feeling in most of us that we are such witnesses.
Be careful, Middle.
We feel that behind the stream of our thoughts, of our feelings and our experiences,
Good riddance.
there is something which is the thinker, the feeler, and the experiencer. Not recognizing that that is itself a thought, feeling, or experience, and it belongs within and not outside the changing panorama of experience. It's what you call
Time to run it down mid,
a
baby.
cue signal. In other words, when you telephone and your
The Lion team.
telephone conversation is being tape recorded,
Good morning,
it's
gamers.
the law that there shall be a beep every so many seconds. And that beep cues you in to the fact that this conversation is recorded. So in a very similar way, in our everyday experience, there's a beep which tells us this is a continuous experience which is mine. Beep. In the same way, for example, it is a cue signal when a composer arranges some music and he keeps in it a recurrent theme,
Enemy spotted. Good riddance.
but he makes many variations on it. Or more subtle still, he keeps within it a consistent style. So you know that it's Mozart all the way along, because it sounds like Mozart. But there isn't, as it were, a constant noise going all the way through to tell you it's continuous, although in Hindu music they do have something called the drone. There is behind all the drums and every kind of singing something that goes and it always sounds the note which is the tonic of the scale being used. But in Hindu music, that drone represents the eternal self, the Brahman, behind all the changing forms of nature. But that's only a symbol.
We got a big brain over here.
And to find out what is eternal, you can't make an image of it, you can't hold on to it. And so it's psychologically more conducive to liberation,
You ought to know better than to mess with me.
to
Time to run it
remember
down mid, baby.
that the thinker or the feeler or the experiencer and the
Just do yourself a
experiences
favor and don't even bother leaving the fountain next time.
are all together, they're all one. But if out of anxiety you try to stabilize, keep permanent the separate observer, you are in for conflict.
We got a big brain over here.
Of course, the separate observer, the thinker of the thoughts,
Somebody's gonna end up calling the police if the cyber
is an abstraction which we create out of memory.
Why was he
We think of the self, the ego, rather, as a repository of memories, a kind of safety deposit box, or record, or filing cabinet place, where all our experiences are stored.
Those cheeks just got clapped.
Now, that's not a very good
You really
idea.
thought you could contain this amount of God-given talent?
It's more that memory is a dynamic
On me,
system,
baby, on me!
not a storage system. It's a repetition of rhythms. And these rhythms are all part and parcel
Sorry, guys. Somebody's gonna end up
of
calling the
the
police if the cyberbullying
ongoing
continues.
flow of present experience. In other words, first of all, how do you distinguish between something known now and a memory? Actually, you don't know anything at all until you remember it. Because if something happens that is purely instantaneous, if a light flashes, or to be more accurate, if there is a flash lasting only 1/1,000,000th of a second, you probably wouldn't really experience it, because it wouldn't give you enough time to remember it. We say in customary speech, well, it has to make an impression. So in a way, all present knowledge is memory, because you look at something and for a while the rods and cones in your retina respond to that, and they do their stuff, jiggle, jiggle, jiggle. It's all vibration. And so as you look at things, they set up a series of echoes in your brain. And these echoes keep reverberating, because the brain is very complicated. First of all, everything you know is remembered, but there is a way in which we distinguish between seeing somebody here now and the memory of having seen somebody else who is not here now, but whom you did see in the past, and you know perfectly well when you remember that other person's face, it's not an experience of the person being here. How is this? Because memory signals have a different cue attached to them than present time signals. They come on a different kind of vibration. Sometimes, however, the wiring gets mixed up and present experiences come to us with a memory cue attached to them. And then we have what is called a déjà vu experience. We are quite sure we've experienced this thing before. But the problem is that we don't see, don't ordinarily recognize, is that although memory is a series of signals with a special kind of cue attached to them so that we don't confuse them with present experience, they are actually all part of the same thing as present experience. They are all part of this constantly flowing life process, and there is no separate witness standing aside from the process, watching it go by. You're all involved in it. Now, accepting that, you see, going with that, although at first it sounds like the knell of doom, is if you don't clutch it anymore, splendid. That's why I said that death should be an occasion for a great celebration, that people should say, happy death to you.
Let's go on an adventure.
And always surround death with joyous rites, because this is the opportunity for the greatest of all experiences, when you can finally let go because you know there's nothing else to do. There was a kamikaze pilot who escaped because his plane that he was flying at an American aircraft carrier went wrong, and he landed in the water instead of hitting the plane, so he survived. But he said afterwards that he had the most extraordinary state of exaltation. It wasn't a kind of patriotic ecstasy, but the very thought that in a moment he would cease to exist, that he would just be gone, for some mysterious reason that he couldn't understand, made him feel absolutely like a god. Well then, in Buddhist philosophy, this a sort of annihilation of oneself, this acceptance of change, is the doctrine of the world as the void. this doctrine did not emerge very clearly, very prominently in Buddhism until quite a while after Gautama the Buddha had lived. We begin to find this, though, becoming prominent about the year 100 BC. And by 200 AD, it had reached its peak.
This will help our cause.
And it was developed by the Mahayana Buddhists. And it is the doctrine of a whole class of literature which goes by this complex name, Prajna Paramita. Now, Prajna means wisdom. Paramita,
What do you want?
for crossing over, for going beyond.
Luck isn't real.
There is a small Prajna Paramita Sutra, a big Prajna Paramita Sutra, and then there's a little short summary of the whole thing called the Hridaya, or Heart Sutra. And that is recited by Buddhists all over Northern Asia, Tibet, China, and Japan. And it contains the saying, that which is void is precisely the world of form, that which is form is precisely the void. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, so on. And it elaborates on this theme. It's very short, but it's always chanted at important Buddhist ceremonies. And so it is supposed by scholars of all kinds who have a missionary background that the Buddhists are nihilists, that they teach that the world is really nothing, there isn't anything, and that there seems to be something which is purely illusion. But of course this philosophy is much more subtle than that. The main person who was responsible for developing and maturing this philosophy was Nagarjuna.
I find these to be
And he lived about 200 AD. One of the most astonishing minds that the human race has ever produced. And the name of Nagarjuna's school of thought is Madhyamika, which means really the doctrine of the middle way. But it's sometimes also called the doctrine of emptiness, or Shunyavada, from the basic word shunya, or sometimes shunya has ta added on the end, and that ta means ness, emptiness.
Grave mistake. Enemy, you will die.
Late game.
Well then, emptiness means essentially transience. That's the first thing it means. Nothing to grasp, nothing permanent, nothing to hold on to. But it means this with special reference to ideas of reality, ideas of God, ideas of the self, the Brahman, anything you like. What it means is that reality escapes all concepts. If you say there is a God, that's a concept. If you say there is no God, that's a concept. And Nagarjuna is saying that always your concepts will prove to be attempts to catch water in a sea, or wrap it up in a parcel. So he invented a method of teaching Buddhism which was an extension of the dialectic method that the Buddha himself first used. And this became the great way of studying, especially at the University of Nalanda, which has been re-established in modern times, but of course it was destroyed by the Muslims when they invaded India. The University of Nalanda, where the dialectic method of enlightenment was taught. The dialectic method is perfectly simple. It can be done with an individual student and a teacher, or with a group of students and a teacher. And you would be amazed how effective it is when it involves precious little more than discussion. Some of you, no doubt, have attended tea groups, blab labs, in which people are there, and they don't know quite why they're there, and there's some sort of a so-called resource person to disturb them. And after a while, they get the most incredible emotions, and somebody tries to dominate the discussion of the group, say, and then the group kind of goes into the question of why he's trying to dominate it, and so on and so forth. Well, these were the original blab labs. And they have been repeated in modern times with the most startling effects. That is to say, the teacher gradually elicits from his participant students what are their basic premises of life.
We got a big brain
What is your
over here.
metaphysic? In the sense, I'm not using metaphysic in a kind of a spiritual sense, but what are your basic assumptions? What real ideas do you operate on as to what is right and what is wrong, what is the good life and what is not? What arguments are you going to argue strongest? Where do you take your stand? The teacher soon finds this out for each individual concerned, and then he demolishes it. He absolutely takes away that person's compass. And so they start getting very frightened and say to the teacher, all right, I see now, of course I can't depend on this, but what should I depend on? And unfortunately, the teacher doesn't offer any alternative suggestions, but simply goes on to examine the question, why do you think you have to have something to depend on? Now, this is kept up over quite a period. And the only thing that keeps the students from going insane is the presence of a teacher who seems to be perfectly happy, but is not proposing any ideas. He's only demolishing them.
This will help our cause.
So we get finally, not quite finally, to the void, the shunya. And what then? When you get to the void, there is an enormous and unbelievable sense of relief. That's nirvana. Phew, as I gave a proper English translation of nirvana.
There's no lying to you. There is one that's stupid.
Great. So they are liberated, and yet they can't quite say why,
You really thought you could contain this amount of
or what it
goddamn
is
talent?
that they found out.
You don't want this
So they
smoke.
call it the void.
Just do yourself
But
a favor and
Nagarjuna
don't
went
even
on
bother
to
with
say,
the fountain next time.
you mustn't cling to the void.
I find these to be quite...
You have to void the void. And so the void of non-void is the great state, as it were, of Nagarjuna's Buddhism. But you must remember that all that has been voided, all that has been denied, are those concepts in which one has hitherto attempted to pin down what is real. In Zen Buddhist texts they say, you cannot nail a peg into the sky. And so, to be a man of the sky, a man of the void, is also called a man not depending on anything. And when you're not hung on anything, you are the only thing that isn't hung on anything, which is the universe. Which doesn't hang, you see. Where would it hang? It has no place to fall on, even though it may be dropping. There will never be the crash of it landing on concrete floor somewhere. But the reason for that is that it won't crash below because it doesn't hang above.
God-given talent. Just do yourself a favor and don't even
So
bother
there is a
leaving
poem
the
in
fountain this
Chinese which speaks of such a person
Guy again.
as having above not a tile to cover the head, below not an inch of ground on which to stand. And you see, this which to people like us who are accustomed to rich imageries of the divine, the loving Father in heaven who has laid down the eternal laws, O Word of God incarnate, O wisdom
I find
from
these
above,
to be quite
O truth unchanged,
riveting.
unchanging, O light of life and love, the wisdom which from the hallowed page, lantern for our footsteps, shines out to me.
Time to run it down mid, baby.
We feel we know where we are, and that it's all been written down, and that in heaven the Lord God is resplendent with glory, with all the colors of the rainbow, with all the saints and angels around and everything like that. So we feel that it's positive, that we've got a real rip-roaring, gutsy religion full of color and so on. But it doesn't work that way. Roaring, gutsy religion full of color and so on. But it doesn't work that way. The more clear your image is got, the less hard as you think. The more it's an idol.
Just do yourself a favor and don't even bother leaving the fountain. We got a big
But
brain over
voiding
here.
it completely isn't going to turn it into what you think of as void.
This will help our cause.
What would you think of as void? Being lost in a fog, so that it's white all around. You can't see in any direction.
Good care of you.
Being in the darkness, or the color of your head as perceived by your eyes. That's probably the best illustration that we would think of as the void.
Somebody's gonna end up calling the police if the cyberbullying continues.
Because it isn't black and it isn't white. But that's still not the void. Take the lesson from the head.
I find these to be
How
quite
does your head look to your
riveting.
eyes? Well, I tell you, it looks like what you see
Just
out
do
in
yourself a
front.
favor and don't even bother leaving the
Because
fountain.
all
next
that you
time.
see out in front of you, how you feel inside. So it's the same with this. And so, for this reason, the great sixth patriarch, Huainan, China, said that it was a great mistake for those who were practicing Buddhist meditation try to make their minds empty.
Late game, late game.
And a lot of people tried to do that. They sat down and tried to have no thoughts whatever in their minds. And not only no thoughts, but no sense experiences. So they'd close their eyes, they'd plug up their ears, and generally go in for sensory deprivation. Well, sensory deprivation, if you know how to handle it, can be quite interesting.
Spread out. On my way.
It'll have the same sort of results
Yup.
as
This is epic.
taking LSD or something like that. And there are special labs made nowadays where you can be sensorily deprived to an amazing degree. But if you're a
You ought to know better than to mess
sort
with
of
me.
a good yogi, this doesn't bother you at all. Send some people crazy. But if you dig this world, you can have a marvelous time in a sensory deprivation. Also, especially if they get you into a condition of weightlessness.
Sorry guys, my brain just disconnected there.
Skin divers going down below a certain number of feet, I don't know exactly how far it is, but get a sense of weightlessness. And at the same time, this deprives them of every sense of responsibility. They become alarmingly happy.
Just do
And
yourself
they
a
have been
favor and
known
don't
to
even
simply
bother
take
leaving
off
the
their
fountain next
masks
time.
and offer them to a fish. And of course, they then drown.
Help, help, help.
So if you
Now that's
skin
too much
dive
IQ
and you
play if I've ever
have
seen
to
one.
keep your eye
Double
on the
kill.
time. You have to have a water watch or a friend who's got a string attached to you. You go down that far, and at a certain specific time, you know you have got to get back. However happy you feel, and however much inclined to say, survival, survival, what the hell's the point of that? And this is happening to the men who go out into space.
You really thought you could contain this amount of
They
God-given
will
talent?
increasingly find that they have to have automatic controls to bring them back. Quite aside that they can't change in any way from the spaceship. Now, isn't that interesting? Can you become weightless here? I said a little while ago that the person who really accepts transience begins to feel weightless. When Suzuki was asked, what is it like to have experienced Satori, enlightenment, he said it's just like ordinary everyday experience, but about 2 inches off the ground. Zhuangzi, the Taoist, said, it is easy enough to stand still. The difficulty is to walk without touching the ground. Why do you feel so heavy?
You really thought you could contain this amount of
It
God-given
isn't just a
talent?
matter of gravitation and weight. It is that you feel that you are carrying your body around. So there is a koan in Zen Buddhism. Who is it that carries this corpse around?
There's no I in team, but there is one in stupid.
So when you feel, common speech expresses this all the
Just do
time.
yourself
Life
a
is a
favor and don't
drag.
even bother leaving the fountain next time.
I feel I'm just dragging myself around. My body is a burden.
Reflex, but okay, you're divine.
When there is nobody left for whom the body can be a burden, the body isn't a burden. But so long as you fight it, it is. So then, when there is nobody left to resist
Always be prepared.
the thing that we call change, which is simply another word for life, and when we dispel the illusion that we think our thoughts, instead of being just a stream of thought, and that we feel our feelings instead of being just feelings, it's like saying, you know, to feel the feelings is a redundant expression. It's like saying, actually, I hear sounds, for there are no sounds which are not heard. Hearing is sound. Seeing is sight. You don't see sights. Sightseeing is a ridiculous word.
This amount of God-given talent?
You could just say either sighting or seeing, one or the other, but sightseeing is nonsense. So we keep doubling our words, and this doubling is comparable to oscillation in an electrical system where there's too much feedback, where you remember in the old-fashioned telephone, where the receiver was separate from the mouthpiece, the transmitter. If you wanted to annoy someone who was abusing you on the telephone, you could make them listen to themselves by putting the receiver to the mouthpiece. But it actually didn't have that effect. It set up oscillation. It started to howl. It'd be very, very hard on the ears.
Just do yourself a favor and don't
The
even
same
bother
way,
leaving the
if you
fountain.
turn a television camera at the monitor, that is to say, the television set in the studio, the whole thing will start to jiggle. The visual picture will be of oscillation, like that. And the same thing happens here. When you get
Trying to run it down mid, baby?
to think that you think your thoughts, the you standing aside the thoughts has the same sort of consequence as seeing double. And then you think, can I observe the thinker thinking the thoughts? Or, I am worried, and I ought not to worry, but because I can't stop worrying, I'm worried because I worry. And you see where that could lead to. It leads to exactly the same